Now we're moving on to our third video, and as you'll be able to see, I've changed the pencil color so we can see what's going on new on this page. So step one was to identify the topics of the paragraphs from your resources and plug them into this source content worksheet. The next step is going to be to decide on the subtopics that you want to use as points in your paragraphs when you write your paper. The third step will be to put unnecessary sources aside. We're not going to throw them away. We may need them later, but we want to get them off of our plate so we can deal with what we know we're going to use. So how do you work step two to decide on the subtopics? Well, one good thing to look at is to look at your grid, your graph, and see, are there things that you see that overlap where you have multiple sources hitting the same point? Here we see that we have two sources that cover change. This would be a good topic to look at because then I can pull multiple sources into the same paragraph. Unfortunately, in the example that I've used here, we only have those two that do overlap. So the next step for me to look at are the topics to see maybe I can cluster some of these together. One thing that I do see is that I have a Native American influence and then I have a slave influence. And if I want to squeeze it a little bit, I actually have the influence on various Japanese foods. So I'm going to look at these three as possibly being grouped together. So I'm going to put circles around those just so that we know what we're grouping. Now that gives me only two topics. That may be enough for the paper that I'm writing, but it may not be. Maybe I want to look and see some other things that interest me here. It looks like I have a lot of examples that I'll be able to pull from. Corn, seafood, beans, cranberries, maple sugar, jerky, macaroni, and then I had the other examples, including the pastry ones that I did not write down. So those are possibilities. But if I'm looking at the Native American influence, I said that 3, 5, and 7, so the corn and the beans and the maple sugar all go under the Native American influence. I want to keep that in mind. Remember that this looked at foods that are considered regional from a lot of different perspectives. Maybe now I'm beginning to start to narrow down to a thesis. And by narrowing down to a thesis statement, I might even be able to figure out better which ones to pull in. Some other things do hit me on the list as possibly being of interest. One is the un-American foods, and another is the food as history. I also like this kind of, the phrase that I have here, adapt, then adopt. That might play a part in looking at the military as first adopters. So there's plenty on my list that I can choose from, even after I look at these two main items. So if I decide on my subtopics as those two big subtopics, I'm going to put any unnecessary sources aside. Well, so far, I'm looking at the Mitsovich source. I'm looking at the Savannah Food Tour and the Pope source. I'm looking at, again, the Savannah Food Tour source. And down here in the Japan adoptions, I'm looking at the Pope source. So based on that, I have nothing checked in my NPR source. However, I may come back to those. So in my stack, I'm just looking at my number 1 source, not my number 2 source. I'm going to put that to the side. I am looking at number 3, and I am looking at number 4. From the topics that I have, I then want to look at working out a preliminary thesis statement. So based on the topics that I'm looking at, I'm going to start kind of outlining an idea of what I want to do. I like the idea about things being ever-changing. Again, I'm getting that topic from the change here. I like the idea that it's multicultural. Again, I'm getting that from the Native American influence, from the former slave influence, and the influence on Japan that these other cultures have had. It looks like it's also historical and maybe immigrant-led. Excuse me. So those are some ideas that I have. Maybe some thesis statements that I want to look at are some things like regional dishes are incorrectly named. What do I mean by that? Well, if they're coming from all over the country and even other countries, are they really regional? Similar to that, maybe I say something like local dishes are not really local. Again, my idea is just to get things onto paper that I might be able to use later. What about something like even the food of the U.S. Displays its current multiculturalism. And maybe I don't like the current, and I can just mark that out. So those are some ideas as far as thesis statements go. So we've walked through the step one of getting the sources and identifying the topics of the paragraphs, putting them into the source content worksheet, then deciding on the subtopics, putting unnecessary sources aside, not throwing them away, but just putting them out of our initial stack. Excuse me. And then working out a preliminary thesis. On to video 4.